Well, that's an awesome story. And I think we're going to get more into that as we look into a couple of questions come up from this dialogue. First of all, you know, what would things have looked like if your parents didn't migrate? And then secondly, did they actually create a better life through migration? And then third, what is this trend for people going back south now that's kind of started in the 1980s or so, where people are looking at going back? And is there any of that family legacy left in the South for those people who are really interested in returning? So lots to cover there. But before we do that, Reverend Robbie, do you want to tell us about your history on migration with your family?
Well, there's not a lot to say for history for me, for migration. My parents, my mother and her parents are from Illinois. I don't know. For most of my family, they all were settled here in Illinois. And so I don't know on my mother's side any other place in terms of family, in terms of Illinois. However, my father came came north when he was much younger, but he came to the north because he was running away from being lynched. And so he came to, wait a minute, something's going on my screen here. And so he came north at that particular point in time. Most of my father's relatives are still in the South. He was the only one that migrated up here. And so I guess when we were younger, we spent our summers just visiting the South.
What part of the South, Robbie?
He was from Alabama, and so he was from Troy, Alabama.
Gotcha. Well, I'll tell you briefly about my history. My parents are from the Carolinas, so I grew up in New Jersey. So we got a pretty, broad spectrum of at least the central to eastern part of the country, and North and South Carolina. So they came north, and I believe I used to tease my aunts and my mom that they thought they were going to New York City. And they ended up getting off the train one stop too soon, and they landed in Newark, New Jersey. So it's interesting, but yeah, I think they all came up for work. There were older siblings who had come up before them. My father had been in the Army in the Korean War. And so we all know the history of some of the soldiers who returned back after fighting wars, to the segregation that they experienced in lynchings in uniform in the South. So definitely the migration was something that I think a lot of people who felt they had the opportunity or the capability of doing, they definitely came, either because other older people told them it was a great thing to do, or they just really ventured out on their own. So, that creates a situation. And like Carol was saying, I think this is a great opportunity to talk about what happened. I mean, in these self-contained communities, which were, not as threatening as the South, there was still quite a bit of segregation going on, right? Redlining, et cetera, in these northern oases, if you want to call it that. And, but was that necessarily a bad thing? Because having a self-contained community created a great economy. So let's talk a little bit about that in terms of Tulsa and other areas.
Okay, so Tulsa was very interesting back in the 20s, and prior. A lot of what happened in Tulsa, people migrated from, Louisiana, Alabama. They came from all over, looking, of course, like we said, for a better life, and we saw that, the Trail of Tears, a lot of the Indians, Black people were also on that Trail of Tears coming to Oklahoma. And also what you had back then was a land grab. So when the Union Army, when we won and the Confederacy, had to cease and desist, a lot of those slave owners and descendants who lost their property or never got it back or it was burned down, they came also a lot of them, for the land grab in Oklahoma, but they settled in the southern part of the state. Okay, we settled in the northern part of the state. So what you have in Oklahoma is you still had some of the KKK type feel to certain parts of Oklahoma. And so when you talk about redlining, when our people started building, they separated us in Tulsa. All the blacks were on the north side, the whites were on the south side. Okay, we there were self-contained. Now this is my paternal roots. They didn't leave Tulsa and go anywhere. The only person that left Tulsa was my father. My grandparents stayed in Tulsa. All their siblings stayed in Tulsa, surrounding area. So what you had was a self-contained community where the dollar exchanged hands, and they had everything they needed. They had movie theaters. They had grocery stores. They had furriers, couriers. They had everything. And as a matter of fact, white people called Black Wall Street Little Africa. That was their name for self-contained 35 square blocks, was Little Africa. And the oil men used to come into Black Wall Street and actually borrow money for some
about that, because Oklahoma has a lot of oil.
We had a lot
etc.
We had a lot of oil, and we had a lot of black people. No, we had a lot of oil. What happened was, due to some of the servicemen coming home. Now it wasn't just the one event that happened in Tulsa. Okay. Now the one event that happened that made this a catalyst of catastrophes was, there was a shoe shine boy. He was very young, and the only bathroom where he was working shining shoes was in this building. And you know how the old elevators ran? They had an elevator person letting you off on the floors. Well, he was trying to get on the elevator, and you know how some of those floors kind of jump, and so the floor kind of jumped, and he bumped into her and grabbed her arm, which she screamed, and he ran because he knew that something was going to happen.
And Carol, it's
what fueled the fire, but what the underlying causes of why it happened is because those servicemen, the jobs, and they saw Black Wall Street very prosperous, self-contained, and they were jealous. And so anything that they could use to, burn it down, that's what they wanted to do, because they felt that we had taken what they should have.
It's interesting because with the oil wealth there too, I was wondering what was under that land in Greenwood, whether or not they just want to build. What happened subsequently is the question. How did your family recover? I mean, I understand insurance companies didn't pay.
They did not pay out.
But they stayed in Tulsa. So what happened?
Okay, so they did not pay out because of the rhetoric, and they called it a riot. Actually, it was a massacre. And they did not pay out. Some of the families had more than one business in other places, other little towns. So like the movie theaters, the family that owned the movie theater, they had 3. One of them got burned down to the ground. That was in Greenwood, but they had other 2 that could sustain them. Okay.
Wow.
The churches that got burned down to the ground in Greenwood, they came back together, and even though they did not get paid out, they finished paying the debt off on the church that got burned down to the ground, and they rebuilt. So people just had to rebuild, and we had lots of lawyers, Black lawyers, that were there on Black Wall Street who were fighting the city because the city was trying to erect codes to stop them from rebuilding back on their own land. But the Black lawyers took them to court and won. And so they were able to reconstruct some of what they had. They could never reconstruct everything that they had, and people had fled and gone other places, and they were fearing for their lives. So it was never what it used to be, but it was very prosperous. John Rogers, Aerial Capital, his father and grandfather, they had the Stratford Hotel there on Black Wall Street, and they fled and came to Chicago. And it was his dream to start another Black Wall Street in Chicago, but he couldn't mobilize the people. And so he couldn't get back, to where it was. But yes, very successful. It was a model for all the cities. And let me just say, it wasn't Black Wall Street was not the only successful Black, self-contained city that got burned down. We got burned down across the United States, from Rosewood, and there was one in Florida that got burned down. So yeah, they were burning us out.
Yeah, there's Memphis, New Orleans. Go ahead, Bonnie.
Yeah.
I just want to say it's such a pattern in America that I just, has been shocked to learn, but, it's so clear that every time we become successful, there is a concerted effort to destroy that success. And by violence or fire or whatever means necessary, even what happened on January 6th, it was just the violent nature of what white America or white Americans are willing to do to keep us from moving forward is horrible. And it's been hidden from us because without the internet, of course, we wouldn't know a lot of things. And even now, they don't want to teach. They're calling it critical race theory, which is the ridiculous name, is history. But but it just is astounding that they've been allowed to get away with this, and that unless you have the right politicians in place or the right police in place, because the police, I learned they were just the Ku Klux Klan.
So that's how they started.
So that's where they came from. And so they're practicing those same things. Yeah.
They were called patty rollers.
Yes.
There to enforce and they were there to enforce and control the slave movement.
Right. So we, what happened in Tulsa and
to
Rosewood, it's still happening. It's still
happening. But what happened was they deputized like 1,300 Klansmen, that night.
Mm-hmm.
They're the ones that, got their posses together. So it ended up being like 3,000 Klansmen that actually, burned it down.
Right.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I think, when you look at what Reverend Powell referenced in terms of the number of elected people in Reconstruction and then the backlash.
Right.
So, and then you look at all of the successive attempts to take the voting rights away from Black people, even up to today. I think you recognize that the political power is where the real change lies in America. You have to take advantage of the political power that we have. And even if they put voting restrictions in place, you have to figure out what it is and do whatever it takes until we get these things reversed, if indeed they manage to sustain some of these voter suppression laws that are being newly implemented. So, going on, I think you guys make some really great points. So when you think about, again, people are migrating, they're creating their own economies, they're having thriving communities, well-educated, well-dressed, professional services, and recirculating dollars in community, and probably sitting on top of some really valuable land at the same time. Then here you have a situation where, despite the fact that you're not being chased out of town at the fear of being lynched, you do have situations where you're being aggregated in certain parts of the city. that may or may not have the same quality of service, the same quality of schools, the same potential value in the real estate. So that kind of gets us into Evanston. And Bonnie, you can tell us a little bit about the Fifth Ward and why reparations are considered applicable to this situation in Evanston.
Well, first, I just want to say, when I was growing up in Evanston, there was segregation, but it was not noticeable segregation for me because I was a child. So when you're growing up, you don't really see the segregation. And it wasn't until I saw Roots and I was a senior in high school that I learned anything about slavery. And it was a shock to my system. And so Evanston really worked hard to protect us, I think, in not talking about race so much. And I don't know, Carol, if you would agree with that, but we did not see the segregation or the racism as children that you see now. But we did all live in the same area, and there were very few of us that lived outside of the Fifth Ward. And there was even a time that in Evanston, they moved houses from the north side of Evanston, which is where Northwestern is, and now considered one of the richest parts of Evanston, into the Fifth Ward. So there were African Americans whose homes were physically picked up and moved. And so I don't know if I would say that was the reason for the reparations, but before I say anything about reparations, I just want to give credit and honor to Robin Ruth Simmons, who is the former alderman of the Fifth Ward, who brought the reparations resolution to the city council. And, you know, I was going to talk about all the dates and all of that, but I just want to share with you that back in 2019, there was a resolution made. And Robin said about, and it was the resolution to talk about reparations, and they had a committee that they formed. But Robin said, let's do solutions only. She really wanted to focus on solutions. And so they had the Equity and Empowerment Commission hold community meetings starting in July of 2019. They had 3 town hall meetings, and they brought everybody together, and then 15 public meetings. And I want you all to know, you can go onto our city website and you can look at all this information at City of Evanston / reparations. And so then they allocated $10 million to reparations. And it's also called the Restorative Housing Program. And so it's very important to know that it was put in place because of housing. In the committees that talked, they realized that housing was the biggest area that the discrimination occurred, and that was the area they wanted to focus on first. Now, it does not mean only, and it's very important that people hear that, because there, you know, is some miscommunication or misinformation out about how, you know, if we say yes to this, we'll never get anything else. No, this is what's first been designated as the area to have the reparations for. So $10 million over 10 years, where that is from the tax proceeds of marijuana. So that is also a very good thing, with $400,000 allocated for 2021. So the committee that I now sit on, that has not had a meeting yet, because in May we just installed our new mayor, Daniel Biss, and 5 new councilmen out of 9. You know, so we have a huge reorganization in Evanston. And so we should be meeting sometime soon to talk about what the application process is. The criteria is pretty much already set, though. You just have to be Black. You have to, or have an ancestor that lived in Evanston between 1919 and 1969 that faced discrimination. And so then you will be able to apply for $25,000 for one of 3 reasons. You can apply for it to purchase your first home. You can apply to it to continue to pay mortgage on your home, to pay your mortgage, or to do rehab and remodeling on your home. So none of these funds are ever going to touch anybody's hands. This is to protect you from taxes. because nobody wants to pay taxes on $25,000 because it's about 20%. And so it's such an exciting opportunity. And I have received calls from people, and I just think we are starting at a place that first in Evanston that other cities are going to emulate. I did just hear that in Amherst, Massachusetts, they have approved monies now just this week. And so, this is where a lot of things begin in the cities. This is how change happens. And we know there's HR 40 that's been sitting in the hands of Congress for a long time at the federal level for reparations. But imagine 5 years ago, we did not hear this. This was not a subject of common discussion. So we are moving forward. You're muted, I think. We can't hear you, Sharon.
I'm talking away to my muted mic.
There you are.
But yeah, it is very exciting. I mean, I think, you're never going to really be able to make up for 100% of all the wrongs. But the idea that, first of all, the history is being recognized and told and acknowledged. And secondly, that people are in positions now, whether elected or their attorneys or the ancestors are, well educated on what actually happened, even though they were children when it started. And we can tell our own stories. That's very important. And it's kind of interesting what you said about the North, is making a difference, because that brings me back to one of my other discussion questions. The civil rights movement started in the South, right? In the 60s, at least. There was a civil rights bill in 1875. And Reverend Powell, you could probably talk about that, but the one we all know is the one in 1964, right? In Rosa Parks and, all that Montgomery bus boycott and all of that. But it started in the South. And when you think about, again, this migration from the South to the North, how the interrelationships between, was one better than the other, or did we just really need all of that to come together? Because when you think about moving from the South to the North, especially like Reverend Robbie said, her dad was in fear of being lynched. Well, when some of those people came north, they published newspapers like the Chicago Defender. And the people in the South were getting those papers free, and they were able to read them and kind of got their mojo going. But the people up north could do that without being lynched. But they motivated the people in the South. So the civil rights movement started in the South. But when we're looking at this reparations, which is, again, a 21st century kind of event, this is kind of starting in the North. So again, I think, when we look at the situation of what's better or what was best, or was it